Okay, now, in the PCT, we're going to wrap this conversation up in the PCT by looking at important pathologies of the PCT. We'll begin by looking at Hartnup disease, and then we'll walk through cystinuria, Fanconi syndrome, obviously I'm emphasizing syndrome on purpose, and type 2 RTA. All right, with heavy metal poison, we'll take a look at lead or mercury. Lead we will spend a lot of time with you tell me, sideroblastic anemia. Why? Quick review. It inhibits two enzymes. One is called ALA. Is it synthase or is it going to be dehydratase? Good. Dehydratase. Take the D in lead and do dehydratase. Look for that enzyme, not synthase. Is that clear? The other enzyme would be ferrochelatase. We will use that information later on when we do our sideroblastic anemia. But you should know in the meantime, the lead also causes what? Lead nephropathy, huh? May cause damage to the PCT. The proximal convoluted tubule will undergo a second example of coagulation necrosis. Second? What was it first? Obviously you know about the heart. Isn't that the prototype when you talk about coagulation necrosis? What does that mean? Take the G in coagulation, and you might want to call it a ghost town. What happens when you walk into a ghost town? No people, but the architecture is preserved. Look at all the buildings. You see them? It's a ghost town. That's what the organ looks like. The architecture is preserved, but there's nobody home. Who's nobody? The nuclei. The nuclei are dead. How do you know? It's called necrosis. What's that mean? Cell death. So therefore, proximal convoluted tubule, or tubular epithelial cells, if they undergo ischemia, they then result in coagulation necrosis. Let me take you one step further. If you did have death of the PCT, and the tubular epithelial cells are dead, they're falling into the urine. Everything is crumbling. It's falling into the urine. They're being sloughed off. They might then aggregate together. What's an aggregation of cells known as in the urine? Called a cast. Good. What am I referring to right now? It's called acute tubular necrosis. What's in my hand? A cast. What can I cast? It's called a muddy brown granular cast. We'll talk about that later with ATN. Make sure that you're able to integrate all this. Move on. Now, produce a nephrotoxic acute tubular necrosis. Okay? Heavy metal poisoning. Specifically, focus upon lead, please. Now, all the normal PCT functions are destroyed when you have damage. So, think of Fanconi syndrome, think about acute tubular necrosis, maybe due to lead poisoning, so on and so forth. So if that PCT is dead, oh my goodness, I cannot reabsorb 66% of my sodium. Welcome to hyponatremia. I cannot reabsorb my 99% of glucose, hypoglycemia, and I cannot take up my literally it's hypouricemia. Remember, with uric acid, that'll be an important component when we have a discussion and further expand upon gout and such. But in general, if your PCT is dead, you're losing a lot of things. Emia means blood. Hypo means lack thereof, because you're losing it. Also, if you have destruction of your PCT, you've completely lost the homeostatic mechanism for phosphate. Remember that vitamin D and PTH work opposite. Listen, vitamin D and PTH work opposite when it comes to phosphate. Vitamin D is going to cause reabsorption of phosphate, whereas PTH wants to get rid of it. But when your PCT is dead, please understand the homeostatic mechanism have also been lost. What else? Well, you're not able to properly reabsorb my bicarb amino acids, so those have been lost. Now, hold on for 1 second here. If you have destruction of PCT, stop. I'm not able to reabsorb bicarb. Are we clear? No chance of carbonic anhydrase working properly. Bicarb gets lost. What about in the plasma? I don't have as much bicarb because things are being lost. So therefore, tell me about the renal threshold for bicarb with reclaiming it. It's decreased, isn't it? There's a decreased renal threshold for bicarb reclaiming. Do you understand the English and the terminology that I just put forth? So if there's decreased renal threshold for reclaiming bicarb, what happens to your bicarb? What's your normal plasma level? 22 to 26. If you're losing your bicarb here in the urine, then my bicarb drops down to maybe 15. What's my pH in your plasma? Decreased. What do we call this clinically? What's your diagnosis? It's called renal tubular acidosis. What kind? Where am I? Proximally. See that X, please? See the X? How many lines did it take to form that X? 1, 2. Oh, yeah, 2. So type 2 renal tubular acidosis is of the proximal renal tubular acidosis. Is that clear? Type 2 RTA is of the proximal convoluted tubule. Do not ever forget that. It's the inability of your PCT to reabsorb the bicarb. I don't care how it happens. Destruction of the PCT, you decrease the renal threshold for bicarb reclaiming. Let's move on. Now, ultimately, when you have generalized dysfunction of the entire PCT, maybe it's due to lead poisoning, maybe it's heavy metals, what have you. But then, generally speaking, this is called Fanconi syndrome. So what is Fanconi syndrome? Do not confuse this with, for those of you that might have heard the diagnosis Fanconi anemia, one has nothing to do with the other. Do not confuse the two. Fanconi syndrome is only dealing with the PCT. It's generalized dysfunction, and so therefore you're going to end up losing everything that we just talked about. You have hyponatremia, you will end up losing your calcium, you end up losing your phosphate, you end up losing your bicarb, you get my point. But this is only in the PCT. Only. Fanconi syndrome will not affect the DCT or collecting duct, and the only difference between syndrome anemia and Fanconi anemia, you want to think of that as being bone marrow disease. And it's an aplastic anemia. Think about where you are. It's a bone marrow. Leave that separate. That's an anemia. This is Fanconi syndrome. Is that clear? Please do not get the two confused. PCT.